All right. So today we have Tasmanian environmentalist and former leader of the Australian Greens, Milne, in the driver's seat. Thanks very much for coming for a drive today, Christine.
Great to be here, Dan.
Excellent. And we've got a beautiful backdrop here today. We've got the Derwent River in the background. Whereabouts are we?
We're at Margate, down the channel in Tasmania. Just beautiful.
Yeah, it's absolutely stunning. We're going to go for a little bit of a drive and we're going to have a chat about your career, and we're going to talk about the history of the Greens, and we're also going to talk about some of the things that you're doing now, which are also quite interesting. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the drive today.
And we're going to see how this Tesla goes.
Oh yeah, I almost forgot. We're going to do a bit of hooning in the Tesla as well.
Okay.
To put it into drive, you just hard down on the right paddle, and then it's just push the accelerator.
Okay, here we go.
Here comes a stinky BMW. It's really I really love coming up to the stoplights next to BMWs or Mercedes, just to show them who's dominant. That electric vehicles are now dominant.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, why you've chosen a Tesla to showcase electric vehicles. A lot of people might suggest that it's quite an elitist vehicle, and that maybe we should have been in a Nissan Leaf, for example, because it's more inclusive, more egalitarian and so on.
Yeah.
And I know that one of the incentives that people are asking for is that they remove the vehicle tax for luxury vehicles when it comes to electric vehicles. And there are people who say, well, why would you when it's a Tesla? So Dan, explain to me why a Tesla is not in the luxury vehicle category, but instead it should be the sort of future vehicle category.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that I get a lot, and there are quite a few reasons why I choose to use a Tesla for this series over other cars. Tesla has always produced electric vehicles. They've never produced petrol or diesel cars at all. So they are a purely electric vehicle company, whereas a lot of other car companies that are producing electric vehicles, they are also still producing petrol and diesel cars and heavily marketing them as well. Tesla's a long way ahead on technology, including battery technology. So the battery packs in these cars will do over 1 million kilometers, which is 5, 6, 7 times more kilometers than you'd get out of a normal car, which means 5, 6, 7 times less iron ore, copper, glass, all the minerals that go into the car. So over the life of the vehicle, you're needing to produce less vehicles overall. Currently, the global car market is 90 million cars per year, and a lot of the major auto companies make their cars quite unreliable, so they can sell more in the future. They've built in redundancy.
Yeah, built-in obsolescence. Yes, we know all about that.
Yeah, built-in obsolescence. Whereas Tesla's business model in the long run is actually around mobility. It's not about selling more cars. It's about creating a really durable, long-lasting car that's
it's entirely recyclable.
Yeah.
That brings me to something else, because people would be saying, well, why are you promoting the driving of private vehicles instead of getting stuck into promoting public transport and more walkable cities? So why aren't you looking at electric buses and obviously electric bikes as well as ordinary bikes and so on? And I guess one of the issues with that is, well, of course, we're not just promoting electric vehicles instead of those. We're promoting electric vehicles for those people who don't have options when it comes to public transport. We're certainly supporting that. But also, Teslas potentially can be really part of that 15-minute city and of the future, with autonomous driving and robo-taxis. So
Yeah.
tell us about that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's such a great question, and I am a massive advocate for active transport. I used to live in Amsterdam. I think Amsterdam's one of the great cities of the world because 70% of people in Amsterdam ride their bikes to work. The air is cleaner in Amsterdam. You don't have the same background noise that you have in Australian cities, and you get to see people's faces when people are on bikes, which kind of strengthens community. So I really want to see our cities be a lot more bike friendly, which encourages people to do short trips, less than 5 kilometres with bike or walking.
I just have to interrupt you here to say that my daughter-in-law teaches at this beautiful country primary school here, the Snug Primary School.
Oh, wow.
It's just gorgeous.
Yeah.
Anyway,
It's got the mountains in the background
yes,
as well.
It's lovely.
I took Senator Janet Rice for a drive a couple months ago in Canberra, and she talks about the thirds rule. So she says a third electric vehicles, a third active transport, and a third public transport.
Yeah.
And I certainly want to see more public transport in Australia as well, but I want to see that public transport electrified.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
There's nothing worse than seeing huge amounts of black smoke pouring out of diesel buses in our cities. It's really nasty stuff.
And take yourself to Mumbai or to Jakarta or even in the Pacific and see that happening. The bus turns up.
Yeah. That's just giving you a little warning when it comes up against the line, so you don't need to worry about that. It's all good.
Okay. Yes, so we need to get rid of that, and of course one of the issues in the Pacific is to give people the ability to borrow money to be able to have electric vehicles, because that was one of the things that shocked me. I spoke to a taxi driver in Fiji who was driving a gas guzzling, pollution belching vehicle, and yet there were there were Priuses in the taxi fleet, the hybrids. And I said, well, why don't you get a Prius, because it'll be a lot cheaper for you, more efficient, and it's better for the environment. And he said he would just love to.
Yeah.
But the problem is that he has no credit rating. He's never had a credit rating, and that the banks in the Pacific are largely Australian-based banks, and the result of that is that he can't borrow money. So tragically, locals can't actually improve their own environment, and expats are the ones who are making the money.
Yeah.
So that's got to change. This is the whole idea of how do you incentivise electric vehicles is really important, and Australia is shocking. We're going in the worst direction. Instead of incentivising electric vehicles, we are imposing taxes on them. We're trying to stop the rollout. There's just virtually, I know that New South Wales has proposed a few things and so on, but we need everything to promote electric vehicles instead of penalising them, as is the current policy setting.
It's such a no-brainer that we should be promoting electric vehicles over internal combustion engine cars, because it's going to benefit everyone. We're going to have much cleaner air in our cities, which is going to benefit the health of every citizen in the country. Diesel particulate is linked to leukemia, asthma, cognitive impairment. So it's such a no-brainer that the government should be incentivising. So why aren't they? And the only reason I can think of is because electric vehicles are a huge threat to the oil industry.
That's right. Look, the issue just simply is the Australian government is a wholly owned subsidiary of the fossil fuel industry.
Exactly.
That's all there is to it. Political donations buy outcomes. He who pays the piper calls the tune. It's very well understood.
Yep.
And the fact is that these companies give so much money to the political parties to make sure that nothing happens to reduce demand for petrol vehicles. And the thing that really distresses me is that Australia will be the dumping ground, because Europe's moved so far. Several countries have now banned the sale of petrol and vehicle engines after, I think, 2025 in a lot of cases, 2030 in some. And so you can just imagine their thinking right now, which is always the horror. They're thinking, oh, where can we dump these vehicles?
Yeah.
Oh, let's dump them in Africa, let's dump them in Asia, let's dump them in Australia. That's just what happens, and it is so wrong when there is clearly one thing about Australians, they love new technology. You know, something comes out and they all have to have it, and I'm just blown away by the fast uptake of solar PV. You just look at the penetration of solar PV because people recognise that it saves them money. Yes, there's a capital outlay in the first place, but in the longer term, it saves them money. The cost of living in that home is much less, and it's more comfortable. You know, they've got more energy to service their needs.
Yep.
And it's a sustainable source, and that's why I think if you can just incentivise electric vehicles, then people will take them up. That it's just in the Australian way, but the government is actively precluding that happening. And it's the same, you know, with solar energy, trying to charge people to be able to put their energy back into the grid. And so people like me and a lot of others are just hanging out for home batteries to come down the cost curve fast enough to make it a reasonable economic proposition to have solar PV on the roof, the electric car in the garage, and the home battery. So that's really, I think, the game changer. If the government isn't going to incentivise EVs, that's what will. And so I'm watching fairly carefully. I've got 6.5 kilowatts on the roof of my house. So I'm just desperate for that. And I go back to when right back in the Rudd years, I went to see Anthony Albanese, who was the Minister for Transport at the time, and I said to him, how many electric vehicles would we need in Melbourne to plug in at the same time to feed into the grid to shave off the peak? And they looked at me, this was back 2007, 8, that sort of thing. And he sent for someone from the department to come and talk to me. So they came over and they said, oh no, Senator, no one's actually looking at that. And so I got interested then in bi-directional EVs, that idea that usually you drive a car out of the car yard and it already loses, 20% or whatever of its value. But with an EV, if it was bi-directional, you could drive it out of the car yard, charge your battery overnight, charge your battery, and then when you go to work, from your home battery, when you go to work, feed it into the grid at peak time and actually make money on it.
Trade electricity
from your EV, because most people would only use it, in a small amount of their battery to get to and from work.
That's right.
But if you had a full battery and you downloaded, say, half of it, then you're making money all the time from this combination of your solar PV, your home battery, and your EV. So that's where I think the next breakthrough will be, because so many people have got solar PV. But we're not quite there yet on the home battery. So I'm just interested in how much Tesla and companies like it are now sort of thinking about bi-directional vehicles.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. There's quite a few really good points you mentioned there. And just going back, like the biggest fear for the oil industry, the gas industry, the coal industry is when people become energy independent and communities become energy independent. It doesn't have to be your own individual house. It could be a community-owned wind farm or community-owned solar with battery packs to support that. This is a nightmare for our largest polluters like AGL and Origin. They don't want that to happen, because they're going to lose their monopoly on supplying electricity to people. And if people can then power their own electric vehicles from community generated electricity, that's the oil industry's worst nightmare, because then they can't sell. They have the monopoly over petrol and diesel. They can't sell these products to people who need them to get around. So what we're really talking about is a decentralization of energy, and with the decentralization of energy comes the decentralization of political power.
Absolutely, that exactly, and that's the same with the whole fight that's on at the moment with the federal government trying to introduce their coal keeper tax.
Yeah.
To try to force people to pay to keep coal-fired power stations operating because they're no longer economically viable.
Paying to pollute.
Paying them to pollute, and at the same time trying to con the international community into thinking we're trying to do something to save the Great Barrier Reef, and that we're actually serious about doing something about the climate. And I just cannot believe the extent to which the international community is conned by Australia time and time and time again. I ran quite a strong campaign to try and stop Matthias Cormann being elected as the Secretary General of the OECD, because this is the man who, of course, led the charge with Abbott to blow up the carbon price we have in Australia and try and abolish the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Renewable Energy Agency, which I'd been central to trying and getting in Australia and having it legislated, and then watching these people tear it down, and then Cormann running for the OECD when the OECD is supposed to be taking a strong stand on climate.
And have we heard Brendan Pearson?
Oh,
is he the advisor?
It's unbelievable that not only did the charm offensive work, flying Cormann all around the world at public expense on the RAAF to go and lobby, but of course, in my view, the only reason he is there and the only reason that Morrison supported him was to stop cross-border carbon tariffs, because clearly that's where the world is going, that if countries like Australia want to behave as vandals, then they'll be dealt with cross-border carbon tariffs. And so America has said that they will let the OECD oversee the process of examining cross-border carbon tariffs. The minute Cormann got there, he said, that would be the last thing that you would look at. Of course it would be, from his point of view. And then over the weekend, I see that Australia has appointed someone who was formerly the Minerals Council, formerly
very pro-coal.
Formerly Peabody. He worked at Peabody.
Which is the largest privately owned coal company in the world.
And now he has been appointed by Australia, having formerly advised Cormann and Morrison, now been appointed as Australia's ambassador to the OECD. It just goes on, and as I said, if the world can't see that Australia is just putting the finger up to it, then they're blind to what's going on. But unfortunately, the bigger picture politics always cut in. I will never forget, I was in Lima. The chooks here by the side of the road.
I've heard about these chooks, actually. Apparently they're quite famous. They're rebel chooks in the area.
When I was at the climate negotiations in Lima in 2014, I took aside several German and other Greens from Europe to talk about how Australia was undermining the accounting rules and that this had to be stopped. And I had several scientists with me presenting all the information. And the European Greens came back later, having been to the European caucus meeting, to say, look, Europe knows full well what Australia is doing, but we're not going to actually do anything about it and call them out, because if we do, Europe will lose Poland. And if we lose Poland, then we lose a united European position, and we need a united European position to go into Paris next year.
Wow.
So it was this thing always about the bigger picture, letting Australia get away with disaster, just like they did in Kyoto in the first place with the Australia clause. So Australia, because it's peripheral really, as far as any other power block is concerned, it's peripheral, but in terms of its pollution, it's not just the emissions that are generated in extracting the gas and coal here. It's of course the massive emissions that when it's burnt, wherever in the world it is burnt, and the next iteration of all this accounting fraudulent behaviour is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage ongoing in order to offset massive increases in gas up at Scarborough in Western Australia. It's really you cannot believe how fraudulent and shameless Australia is in the international community.
I think that all the things that we've seen over the last few years, all the corruption and manipulation that's been happening, they might be getting away with it now, but they won't get away with it in the future, because this transition is underway, and there is a rapid transition that is happening now. The world is rapidly moving to electric vehicles.
Yep.
Companies like Tesla's the fastest growing car company in history, and even in Australia, which has the slowest rate of uptake of EVs in the world at less than 1%, even in Australia, in July, new car sales of electric vehicles were up 400% on last year.
Yeah.
Now that's only going to grow, and with that growth, the faster that grows, the faster the oil industry dies. And the faster the oil industry dies, the less money they have to corrupt our democracies around the world.
Correct.
And we'll see a death spiral that starts happening, I think.
We're already in it. We're already in it. That's why they're bringing in a coal keeper tax to try and prop it.
It's desperation stuff.
Desperation to prop it up, and they're trying to criticise banks that won't lend to these polluters.
It's so blatant,
They're trying to, they're trying to do any kind of devious pressure they can on insurance industries who won't insure. So it's desperation. We are already in the death throes, but we need not underestimate how much damage they can do as they go down. And that's precisely what we're looking at. But I really think in Australia there is no resistance to electric vehicles. I don't think people actually bought that rubbish about tradies and the weekend.
Oh yeah,
all that nonsense.
Ruin your weekend. Won't tow your boat, all that garbage.
It's just garbage, and everybody knows it's garbage. I really think the major disincentive is really cost.
Mm-hmm.
People are thinking, yep, I'd really like one if I could get one. And then secondly, the network of charging stations, just to make sure you've got a viable network. Now, the Good Car Company in Tasmania is doing a great job to address the cost issue and bringing a number of second-hand electric vehicles into Tasmania, and as I understand it, they're getting taken up at the rate of knots, which just goes to the point about cost. And then the charging stations, they're gradually being rolled out, and in Tasmania, I saw in Campbelltown the other day in one of the car parks there that there were a couple of charging stations. So it's happening, as you say, regardless of the extent to which governments try and frustrate it, it's actually happening. So
and it's a grassroots kind of thing as well, really.
Yeah, it's very exciting, and in fact that's where the optimism has to come in terms of the future. It's what ordinary people now do, recognising that governments are still under the influence of the old way of doing things, and bought by the fossil fuel industry, people are now going, well, I've had enough, and are actually standing up. And that's what's terrific about things like Extinction Rebellion, direct action in the forests, direct action up at Adani. People are actually standing up and doing what they can. And always have been a big supporter of non-violent direct action. I got arrested on the Franklin, went to jail then.
I was going to ask you about that, actually. What did that, because I've also been arrested, but only recently, like the last 2 years. What did that feel like were you nervous at the time?
I was terrified. I was terrified, especially because this is 1983 Tasmania, and I was teaching on the northwest coast in a town where there was a large hydro depot. So a lot of the kids at school were the kids of the hydro workers and so on. And a large number of the environmentalists who came down on the Franklin, the protesters, actually came from interstate. And so Tasmanians really copped the brunt of the abuse subsequent to the stopping of the dam and so on. And in fact, I had parents in my school where I was teaching complain to the headmaster that I wasn't a fit and proper person to teach their kids because I'd been to jail. And the headmaster, to his credit, just took me aside and said, look, I will back you all the way, but you have to be doubly sure that you don't talk about this in any shape or form in the classroom, which of course I hadn't and wouldn't, recognising what that would mean. But yes, it was pretty tough going. But the thing is, it was the most empowering thing that I think I had done. Because, I'd been a pretty law-abiding until then, I think, having come from a very conservative upbringing on a small dairy farm in northwest Tasmania, you know, largely country party voting type of area, I'd never had anything to do with politics. And
Similar to me, actually. Yeah. Similar background.
And so when I went to university, I was naive enough to still think that if you presented the evidence about something, then clearly decision makers would make the right decision.
Yeah.
And then
How naive.
how naive, but you know, that's how we thought.
Yeah.
And the upshot was that there I was at university, and the evidence was clear that we should not be flooding Lake Pedder. And instead of that, the Hydroelectric Commission at the time wanted to build the biggest sheet of water in the southern hemisphere, and basically were so carried away on this engineering dream that the evidence didn't matter. And so permission was given to flood Lake Pedder, you know, one of the greatest acts of vandalism in environmental terms. This is one of the most beautiful places in the world, and for that to happen. And so after that I thought, right, that's it. Never going to let that happen again. The next time they do that, I will be there.
Yeah.
And so in the between years between 72 and 83, I had a year in Europe, and I went to all of the places that I'd learnt about, because mine was a very English education in spite of being in Tasmania. And so I went to see Sherwood Forest and discovered it had been cut down. I went to see the Black Forest in Germany and saw it was dying of acid rain. I went to see the Blue Danube and it was brown, and I thought, really, it was the first big education that things are not necessarily going to last. And that really came home to me. So I came home to Tasmania. They proposed building a dam on the Franklin River, and I thought, right, that's it. As I said, I'm going to be there. But there I was, pretty conservative teacher, and went upriver, got arrested, and then on the way back down to Queenstown had to decide whether I would go to jail or not, whether I'd sign the bail conditions or not. And one of the whole aspects of the campaign was that we wanted to block up the jail system and make the whole thing unworkable. And so I thought, right, well, I'm in this for a penny in for a pound, as they used to say. So I refused to sign the bail conditions and went to Risdon. And the reason I say it's one of the most empowering things I've ever done, and I say this knowing that if I was an Indigenous or Torres Strait Islander, this would be an entirely different experience in Australia. But as a female white teacher going to jail in Tasmania, you know, I was in the prison, yes, but I was not abused or, you know, treated badly in that sense. And so the upshot of that was that when I came out, I thought, you know what, the only thing that they can do to me is arrest me and put me in prison, and I can cope with that. So from here on in, I'm up for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of activists, I mean, we call them activists, but they're really just people who are passionate about protecting the environment and protecting
their home and protecting what's important, and you know, standing up for the right thing.
I love, I can't remember the person who quoted it. I think it's a South American activist, but the quote is, "We are not defending nature, we are nature defending itself."
Precisely. And we're defending our home. I mean, we are all living on planet Earth, and whatever happens to the Earth happens to us all. So that's it.
And I think a lot of, I was going to say, a lot of activists or people who get into activism, there is that pivotal moment where they realise how much power that all of us have, really. And I went through the same thing when I did some civil disobedience actions with Extinction Rebellion 2 years ago. And before that moment, I used to wave my fist at the TV in anger with some of the decisions that were being made. But then once I was introduced to activism, I realised, wow, we all have so much more power than we realise.
Exactly, and that's why Tabitha, who's in the back seat. Tabitha and I
Hi,
are
Tabitha.
working together on trying to restore Lake Pedder because, a lot of young activists say to me, well, it's all very well for you. You've had some big wins. You stopped the Wesleyvale pulp mill. You stopped the Franklin Dam. You've been part of doubling the size of the World Heritage Area. You've protected forests. You've had some wins. But they say for us, we are battling all the time and things are getting worse. We're seeing biodiversity collapse. We're seeing climate collapse. We're seeing, the current IPCC assessment that if the current pledges are as they are, then we're on for 2.7 degrees and higher. So young people are saying, it's pretty depressing. We're working as hard as we can. We don't seem to be getting anywhere.
Yep.
And so it's really important to say to them, look, you just keep on going because you never know when some amazing disruption will occur, or as we describe it, as something falls out of the sky, and everything will change. And in many ways I see the disruption that's coming with electric vehicles, the disruption with renewable energy, distributed localized energy, all these things, they are incredibly disruptive technologies. And so they're fantastic, but they're not enough, because the other big disruption, of course, is to restore the earth. And we need to now go back and not only protect what's left, but restore as best we can ecosystems. And so the restoration of Lake Pedder is alongside protecting Tasmania's forests and stopping Adani and all the rest, stopping the Scarborough and the Northwest Shelf. But it actually is incredibly hopeful, because it means that those young activists can see that they are actually putting something back for nature and doing it right now in our backyard. And Lake Pedder is in a World Heritage Area, so it's already got global recognition for being an outstanding place, outstanding universal value. And I think it's pretty exciting. The original lake was 10 square kilometres. The impoundment is 242 square kilometres. So it's a big area.
It's massive,
There are 3 dams that constrain the impoundment, so they have to go, and that water goes, and then we restore this amazing heart of the wilderness, and we get the beach back, we get the lake back, we get the Serpentine River back, we get a real injection into species, into species resilience, and particularly with platypus, for example, because you're going to provide them with a whole lot more habitat. But Tabitha, you might want to say something about why, as a younger person, you're interested, because often I get accused of, this is a nostalgia trip. For old people like you didn't succeed the first time around, you're not going to die without having another go at it. But it's actually not about that. It's very much looking forward. So,
it's about hope, really.
Yeah, it's about hope.
It's such an optimistic project. Obviously, I was never old enough to go to the original lake, so I have no emotional connection to that original place. But what Christine touched on before, our generation have only ever known loss. We consistently see the destruction of our forests, our rivers, our oceans, and it's as imperative to stopping the climate crisis that we do restore our natural environment as it is to stop the ongoing destruction. We do have to do both. And you look at the pivotal moment in history that the flooding of Lake Pedder was in terms of conservation, and really that set in motion the movement that prevented the Franklin from being dammed. All the other non-violent direct action since then, and you just wonder how extraordinary the movement will be when that Lake Pedder is restored.
The confidence that it'll give the movement and the hope.
Absolutely.
Because you're so right. Like, young people today are watching this destruction play out in real time, and they're also watching our leaders do nothing to stop it, and that's gut-wrenching and depressing. But when we do start to see the rewilding of our beautiful country, and when we do start to see our leaders take serious action, that will be a massive boost to the environmental and climate movement, not just in Australia but around the world. And that will tip the scales. And countries like Norway, they're already rewilding areas in net terms. New Zealand has a 1,000-year rewilding plan that's being driven by the Maori Party in New Zealand, I understand. There are amazing things happening out there, and we can do the same here.
Well, that's and this is also really important in terms of green politics around the world, because it was the campaign to try and stop the flooding of Lake Pedder that led to the establishment of the world's first Green Party, the United Tasmania Group.
I really wanted to talk to you about that as well, so I'm glad that we got there.
And so, yes, it was out of complete frustration that people were not able to make the powers that be see sense, either in Tasmania or nationally, that at a meeting at the town hall in Hobart they formed the United Tasmania Group to contest the state election. And it was just incredible, actually. And Alagus Trahanas, who is a renowned wilderness photographer, had been to Canberra to present his slideshow, his famous slideshow, to the Labor caucus, which helped to change their mind. But the upshot was it was not enough. That Tasmania, Eric Rees, Electric Eric, was determined to see the Lake Pedder drowned, and not so very different from Robin Gray years later describing the Franklin as a brown leech-ridden ditch. It's the same sort of contempt for the wild that Eric had. So yes, in 2001 we had the very first Global Greens meeting in Canberra, and it was at that meeting that we ratified the Global Greens Charter, which is basically the set of rules which a Green Party has to agree to become part of the Global Greens. So there's some sort of accreditation around Green Parties around the world. And at that meeting, I met a group of young Greens from Brazil. And at the end of the meeting, I said to them, are you going to stay in Australia for a while? Where are you going to go? Are you heading up to the reef? Because usually they want to go up to the Great Barrier Reef. And they said, no, we're going down to Tasmania. And I, fabulous, that's great. And they said, we're going to Lake Pedder. And I said, that's incredible. And they said, well, no, we're going to pay homage to where the Greens started.
Oh, wow.
And that just really brought home to me that Lake Pedder is really the heart of green politics. And so restoring it has a message that will resonate with Greens wherever they are in the world. And we've got elected Greens in over 90 countries now.
Wow.
So it will actually take Tasmania back out there as a global icon and a beacon of hope, as Alagus identified all those years ago. So I'm very excited about the possibilities for Pedder, and I've been speaking to the people at the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration about the role that universities might play. And I've been saying that, the Tasmanian University would be a great place to include, and talking to the university itself about having ecosystem restoration as a cross-cutting theme of the university. So I just think we are on the cusp of perhaps a more rapid shift than people have anticipated. I think there will always be a tipping point, and we know in ecosystems we've probably passed a number of tipping points, rather sadly. And what the ramifications of that is going to be is terrifying when it comes to global ocean circulation and glacial melt and sea level rise and the permafrost thawing and so on. It's huge. But I also get the sense that the people's movement is rising.
Absolutely.
And Greta Thunberg and the student strikes have been part of that, but they're not the only part of that. We're now seeing people moving in all kinds of fields. Tesla, but everywhere.
It's an orchestra, really.
Yes, it is an orchestra, and we've had lousy conductors.
Very lousy conductors.
Lousy conductors. conductors.
But those conductors are about to get the sack.
They are, and that's where I think, we've got a lot to hope for. So
Yeah.
with the restoration of Pedder, next year is the 50th anniversary, which coincides, as you know, with this first year of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and I feel like it could be a real catalyst for a change in Tasmania and globally.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree that change is going to happen a lot faster than people anticipate, and I've been saying that like this decade is the decade of exponentials. So we're seeing an exponential growth in electric vehicles, we're seeing exponential growth in renewable uptake, we're seeing an exponential growth in the climate movement around the world. More and more people are getting into activism, myself included. I only became an activist 2 years ago. It's something I never thought I would be arrested or be doing these civil disobedience actions, but I am, and I'm loving it, and I'm encouraging other people to do the same.
And the other thing is about being an activist, and I think it's important to say this, is that you don't actually have to be arrested and go to jail to be called an activist. In fact, we just need to encourage everybody to be an activist in whatever profession or field they're working in. So if they're working in a kitchen, they can be talking to the boss about waste management, about what they're actually cooking, how the menu could be different to be more sustainable. That is being an activist in that context. If you're a doctor, you can be getting behind the climate movement because eco-health is critical for human health. If you're an engineer, you can start talking to people about, well, what sort of materials are we using in this construction project we're designing? Could it be more sustainable?
Exactly.
Could it be different? Yeah, so my point to young people is you don't have to drop out of a career in order to become an activist.
Mm-hmm.
You need to do what you're passionate about: medicine, engineering, teaching, farming, whatever you're passionate about, public relations, printing, graphic design, doesn't matter. But do the environmental activist end of it. Think about how you can use your skills to advance addressing global emissions and protecting biodiversity, and also climate justice. Think about inclusion, think about how this might affect people who are less well off, and so on and so forth. So I think that's really the mindset we need to bring, so that people don't feel somehow inadequate if they are not getting arrested. What they are doing really matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add to that, every conversation counts. Every conversation matters. So the conversations that you have with your hairdresser or with the person who's making your coffee in the morning, these conversations really, really matter. And we're seeing a massive shift in the media around the world as well. So the mainstream media has really dominated the narrative on issues like climate and environment for decades. But what we're seeing now is the rise of social media is that environmentalists and other activists are able to get their stories out there a lot easier than they used to be. And I always talk about the Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd protests last year. When we compare that to the Rodney King incident that happened in the 90s, and we say, well, when Rodney King bashing happened, there was maybe 4 or 5 mass media organizations who controlled that narrative. This was before social media, before Twitter. And so that narrative was set by these 4 or 5 mainstream media companies. Fast forward, 20, 25 years to the George Floyd protests, and the mainstream media is trying to run a particular narrative on that incident, but people were posting videos of police brutality on Twitter and getting millions of views, and the mainstream media had to report on that. So this is citizen journalism that's happening now.
It's another example of disruption.
Yeah.
And it's exciting, and it's also a window into how people can help those activist movements out and people out on the front line.
Mm-hmm.
Because the other thing about the mainstream media is that they have cut back so much. Journalists these days have to be everything. They basically have to be the camera person, they have to be the sound person, they have to be the edit person. They basically have to do the whole story. And as a result, they are vulnerable to the packages presented to them by the fossil fuel sector or the people that we are campaigning against, because basically it's easy if someone comes and says, here's a story, I've got the talent, I've got on the story, I've got the footage, I've got everything, here you are, you can just go with it.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to struggle to have the people who can put together the same package. We have got the various talent people to be interviewed, we've got the places, we've got the whole story.
We've got the content.
We've got the content, we just don't have the technical skills in many cases to make it happen.
Yeah.
And so I'd really like people to think about, well, I can actually do that, and that could be my contribution.
Yeah, video editors and, as you said, graphic designers, all those kind of people.
All those things.
Can help extend the reach of activist message, really.
Oh, I can't tell you how much I would love to have that as I sit in my lounge room, raging against everything on Twitter and so on. I just think, we just need those people with technical skills.
Yeah, absolutely. You've watched all this play out over the years. You were there in the early days with the Tasmanian campaigns, and you were also in Parliament during the Gillard government when the carbon tax was introduced, and you were there when it was repealed as well. So you have a better knowledge of the environmental and climate movement in Australia, probably more than anyone in the country. There wouldn't be many that have seen more than yourself. So I'm interested to hear what were those periods like, or the climate movement, what was that like 10 years ago, and where is the movement now compared to then?
Okay, so yes, I was there in the early days and elected to the Senate in 2004 and took my seat in 2005, and of course Howard was still there, so it was pretty grim. He had control of both houses at the time. Mm-hmm. So that was pretty grim, but we kept on going. Rudd was then elected, and it disappointed me the extent. I think it was a lesson in how managing the media narrative matters so much. Rudd went off to Bali to the Conference of the Parties and announced that Australia would ratify the Kyoto Protocol. Mm-hmm. Everybody rose to their feet. It was standing ovations. Australia was back in the tent. It was fabulous, and so on. But behind the scenes, the Australian negotiators removed there was a line in the negotiation text that said developed countries had to reduce their emissions between 25 and 40% on 1990 levels in order to allow developing countries the space to grow. Mm-hmm. Australia was one of the countries responsible for removing that from the text and putting it in the footnotes, and Rudd stuck to a 5% emission target thereafter. And I just thought, talk about manage the media. He was portrayed as a hero, but in fact it was just 101 Australia doing business at climate talks, undermining the rest of the world. And that has happened every time since, and so it won't surprise me at all if you get Morrison turning up in Glasgow, COP26, and announcing that he will agree to net carbon zero by 2050, and everyone will go, oh great, Australia's back in the tent. Absolutely meaningless rubbish, because they won't have a target for 2030, and you just, this business of 2050, I look back now and think, does anybody who did anything in 1992 or 91, are they held accountable for anything that's happened 30 years later? People can't even remember.
That's right.
And so that's why they get away with this stuff instead of a realistic time frame where they will be held to account. In terms of, we had known that the key way of getting progress on climate, given that Labor's nearly as bad as the Coalition on climate and always has been, they still support this is to get balance of power. And so when we got balance of power in the 2010 election, it was on the back of the CPRS, and oh God, talk about revisionism with the CPRS.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, let me tell you, that is just ridiculous. The climate movement surrounded Parliament House, you know, a big chain around Parliament House, objecting to Rudd's CPRS because it was a mere 5%, and the entire environment movement, with the exception of a couple of notables, opposed the CPRS because it was such a weak target, and we all knew that 25 to 40% was what was required. And this is where balance of power matters. In the ACT, the Greens did get balance of power, and they did make it a condition of that the ACT legislate 40% reduction on 1990 levels by 2020, and that is why the ACT now is such
100%.
a leader. Such a leader, and it is because of the Greens back then in 2009-10 when they got balance of power. So we know, and we did it in Tasmania, you know, we doubled the size of the Wilderness World Heritage Area because we had balance of power. When I had balance of power with a Liberal government in 1996, that's how I got gay law reform. That's how I got gun law reform. And so we knew it. So when we got balance of power in 2010, you know, Bob and I discussed it, and I just said, you know, we have to make a carbon price, this package, we have to get a carbon price, and it has to be legislated before 2012 as part of the conditions for government. And so we negotiated that with Gillard, and she agreed that there would be a multi-party climate committee and that we would legislate a carbon price by July 2012. And that was a condition of getting government, and so she held to that and held to the multi-party climate committee. Greg Conway and I were the deputy chairs of that committee, and we worked very hard. Now the Greens put on the table the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and ARENA, because up until then the incentives for solar in Australia had been all over the shop and inconsistent and not very good, and so we got ARENA in place as a statutory organisation, and then the CEFC, we got that idea from the Green Bank in the UK. And the UK had been terrific. The UK High Commission in Canberra had been fantastic in providing us with lots of information and advice about the Green Bank in the UK and so on. So we got that on the table, and then we asked for the $10 billion off budget. Now people told us we were off our heads, that we'd never get $10 billion for renewable energy, and I said, well, it was a compromise because, again, the Gillard government was not prepared to look at 350 parts per million. They would not look at a carbon price that would reflect 350 parts per million. They wanted 450 parts per million, or even more than that, 550, even though 550 was well above the 2 degrees.
Is this, I want to keep going with that line, but just on a side note, is this because the Labor Party still takes donations from companies like Chevron, Woodside and Santos? Is this why they're trying to get the ability to pollute more? Is it because they're also beholden to the fossil fuels?
Yeah, they're also beholden to the fossil fuel industry, but as much as the donations, it's the unions as well.
Right.
So as you will have seen recently with all the factional deals over parachuting Christina Keneally from the Senate into a
yes,
seat
I did
in
catch
Sydney
that.
and so on. It's all about the factional deals. Now the CFMEU has been a very strong supporter of native forest logging, coal mining and the rest. And so the union movement has been another major drawback, if you like, on getting Labor to shift, as well as the donations. But if you look at the donations register, they still pretty much get donations from a lot of fossil fuel. But I have to say, some in the union movement are shifting. They recognise that these jobs are going out the back door. They also recognise that there are a lot of jobs in the renewable energy sector. And so there's quite a bit of progress in recent times in the union movement. But having said that, you know, does the Labor Party support Beetaloo? Do they support Adani? Do they support Scarborough? Answer, yes.
Yes, they do, yeah, it's horrible.
Do they support native forest logging in Tasmania and New South Wales? Yes, they do.
And getting back to when the Greens had the balance of power with independence federally, I've seen a graph of Australia's carbon emissions over time, and they're going up, and then there's a dip during those years, and then they start to go up again a few years later. So it's clear that when federally we have Greens and independents in the balance of power, that emissions do come down. And for people who want to vote on climate for the next election, getting Greens and independents into the balance of power is the best way to get Australia to take serious action on climate.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, the independent push is a bit unclear as well, because a lot of people are calling themselves climate independents.
Yep.
But all they're saying is they support net carbon zero by 2050, which is no different from any of the dodgy LNP suggestions and so on. And this is my problem with people who say they are climate aligned independents. Well, what do they actually support? Okay, net carbon zero by 2050, but do they support approving new coal and gas? Do they support expanded coal and gas? Where do they stand on those things? And that's where I think you need some clarity, because I think people are being misled to a certain degree. Zali Steagall's bill is still only net carbon zero by 2050 or anything else in between. Yeah. Well, let's see something serious about the supply side. And that's why I'm a big supporter of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Because...
And you're on that board as well, is that right?
I'm not on their board, but I'm one of their advocates.
Oh, yeah.
So they have recognised that the Paris Agreement is all about the demand side, which of course the large fossil fuel industries love, trying to put the blame back on ordinary people for what they consume, because it takes the focus away from them on what they supply.
Yeah, and just on that, they recently, I saw a story in The Guardian a couple of weeks ago that said that it came out that BP had actually funded PR firms to create this carbon footprint concept 15 years ago. Yep. Did you catch that?
Yes, I did, and that's exactly right. The fossil fuel industry have tried to shift the blame back onto ordinary people and their carbon footprint to distract from the fact that how much they supply. Now, when we deal with drugs, you don't go after the consumers of the drugs, you go after the pushers.
The dealers,
The dealers and the pushers.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we should be doing, because you're only talking about a couple of hundred companies worldwide. Now, we have enough people in the climate movement now broadly across the world to really target those 200 companies, and with the support of the banking sector, the finance sector, the insurance sector, we can make life very hard for those companies. And of course they want to push it back onto, oh, well, you could walk more at home, you can grow more of your own vegetables, you can turn out the lights, you can switch off the power points, you can get a few more solar panels. Of course they're going to support that, because it takes away from the reality that they are the pushers. And so that's why the Non-Proliferation Treaty, I think, is a good thing. And if you look at the Paris Agreement, the words fossil fuels do not appear.
Oh, really?
No, they're not in the forest. They're not in the Paris Agreement. And if you look at who are the sponsors to the conferences of the parties on climate, a whole lot of them are your big fossil fuel producers. And you look at the sponsors for the climate COP in Glasgow. One of them is Scotland's biggest energy producer, which of course is still producing the fossil fuels. So they know that as long as the climate focus is on the consumer or demand side and not on the supply side, they're safe. And that's why they're coming up with all these offsets ideas. Oh, you, the consumer, can offset what you do by paying more and doing this and doing that. Well, how about how you can reduce by not buying this stuff?
And stop burning it to begin with.
Stop burning it, instead of just saying, oh, you can go and pay some money to offset it somewhere. And offsets, I guess that's one of the things I hate most is this concept of offsets.
Offsets is just greenwashing. It's a farce, isn't it?
It's a farce, and it is completely... it's just business as usual.
It misleads people into thinking that they're taking action when actually they're not.
And it misleads people into thinking that there is a carbon budget that can still absorb more fossil fuels. And the reality is there is no carbon budget for additional fossil fuels. And to say, oh, well, I can offset the Scarborough gas field, which is pumping methane to atmosphere immediately, I can offset that by planting a few trees in Western Australia, which in 25 years may or may not be still alive.
Yeah, it's madness. And we need to rewild anyway.
It's just, it drives me crazy, I have to say. So that whole issue of accounting is going to be one of the big things in COP26 this year, because they're going to be signing off on the rules for carbon trading. And there's a whole lot of people making a lot of money as middlemen now in the carbon offsets business. And, you know, running around to the big fossil fuel producers saying, don't worry, we can offset your emissions by getting governments to invest in tree planting projects and so on and so forth. Now, we certainly need to restore native forests. We need to restore native ecosystems. There's no doubt about that. But it should not be, as it cannot offset immediate release of methane to atmosphere now. Full stop.
And we know that all the technology is there to transition off fossil fuels. We know that.
How beautifully this accelerates.
Yeah.
By the way. It's just lovely. Yeah.
We'll take a break from that conversation, because I'd love to show you the autonomous driving as well if you're interested.
I'd love to. I'm just going to find a spot to pull over, or.
Oh no, you can stay in this lane.
Okay.
Now, what's going to happen? I'll just explain what'll happen first. So when you double tap down on the right hand paddle, two blue lines will come up here, and you'll be in autonomous mode. Then just be gentle with the wheel. It'll actually turn itself. You can keep your hands on there, but it'll move. If you pull it, it'll pull out of autonomous mode. And you can also knock the paddle up to take it out, or you can hit the brake at any time. So you can take over any time. Sure. So just two down on that one. Yep. There you go. Now that's it. Now this is bread and butter. I drove 90% of the way from Melbourne to Central Queensland in this mode and didn't have any problems whatsoever. So
yes, I know, but it requires a leap of faith to put your hands put your life into the wheels of a car, if you like.
Yeah. Now every now and then, it's all right. Every now and then, it's just going to ask you just to move it slightly. So that's good. That's still good now. It'll just prompt you to let it know that you're still awake or you're still there, basically. So now you're driving.
Okay, so
just come in. Yep, that's it.
So it's that.
Just try again. And now let go. Just let it come through. You're driving, so let it come through this Form 1 lane to the Form 1 lane. So we just come over into the lane.
And now
just wait till you're in the middle. Try once more. Now let go. Now you're good. Yep. It's locked on to those lanes. You'll see even within the lane, it's holding very much in the center. So it's super accurate. The processing power in this car is phenomenal, and you've got 8 cameras that are looking out for you at the moment. Just a slight touch. There we go.
So you drove it from where to where without basically putting it back into manual?
So I drove from Melbourne to Clermont. I'd say at least 90% of the way in autonomous. As I went through cities, I had to disengage and take over. But on the freeways and highways, I was 90%, at least 90% in autonomous. And as I mentioned earlier, Tesla's actually testing their full self-driving beta package around the world, and they're doing point-to-point driving through cities. That's pulling up at stoplights automatically, accelerating it when the light goes green, doing left and right turns at traffic lights, multi-lane traffic, overtaking, roundabouts, even pedestrians, picking up pedestrians as they cross zebra crossings.
So how do you propose to keep people awake?
Well, you may not have to in future.
So this is the reason I ask is that when I was in the Tasmanian Parliament, I was driving backwards and forwards from the northwest coast of Tasmania to Hobart frequently. It's 3.5 to 4 hours depending on the traffic, and I would be so tired sometimes. And once, and this is after I left the Parliament, I did go to sleep and ended up focus on the road or whatever, is there any sort of research or evidence or anything about people going to sleep in autonomous mode and whether the car actually saves them?
Yes, it's a really good question, and I haven't seen any reports of that happening in autonomous mode, people just falling asleep. One of the things it does do is, basically when you're driving, you're making like thousands of little calculations all the time. But when you're in autonomous mode, the car's obviously doing that for you, and so it's actually, you're not having to focus as much, and you're not getting tired as quickly. I found when I was driving in autonomous mode for long distances that I was more rested when I wasn't as exhausted when I got to where I was going. The other thing is that if you do fall asleep in this car and you don't, because you'll notice it's prompting you to touch the wheel. If you don't touch it for a while, it'll start beeping at you. It'll hold the lane, and this will do it automatically. This is fine.
Oh.
Alright, so now you're driving now.
Yeah, sorry.
That's all right. It just takes a little bit of getting used to the feel of it.
Yes.
But yeah, what I was going to say was, if you didn't touch the steering wheel for some time, it'll start beeping. If you still don't touch it, the car will actually slow down. It'll hold the lane, and it'll put the hazard lights on, and it'll find a place to pull over safely.
Fantastic.
Yeah. So even if you have a heart attack, this car has like got your back, basically.
That in itself is great. So I was just going to say that when you're talking to people about the benefits of the car, these safety benefits are quite extraordinary for busy people who are on the road a lot.
Yeah.
But also for older people.
Yeah.
Because people may be a bit frightened of the technology, frightened of the idea of handing over control to a vehicle.
Yeah.
But that idea that, even if you do go to sleep, or if something happens to you and you happen to be driving in those circumstances, the car will actually look after you is quite a message.
It is,
really?
and the message needs to be reframed as, so like the car, you're not giving away control to the car. You're actually working with the car, and the car, like, you're still in control, but the car has got your back, is a better way of thinking about autonomous driving. So you're still totally in control, and you can take over anytime you want, but the car is also looking out for you along the way. And I took Andrew Wilkie for a drive a couple of weeks ago, and we spoke a lot about this as well. This car, with the current software, even when you're driving, if a car pulls into us, or something happens, this car will take action to avoid a collision. And it's so good that you're 10 times less likely to get into an accident just from the software in this car, right? So that's 10 times less accidents, 10 times less deaths, 10 times less trauma, and all the other things that happen when people get into these terrible accidents.
10 times less GDP.
Oh, yeah.
Which just shows how ridiculous GDP actually is on this sort of police car.
Yeah. Yeah, don't worry, they won't catch us in this anyway, so. But yeah, that's it. Like, the whole GDP thing is completely
Well, it's one of the big problems we've got. That's why I just said it, that they count car accidents and disaster as a good thing in terms of economic growth. So
panel beating and repairs and maintenance and that kind of stuff.
That whole industry around economic growth has to stop.
Yeah.
We just have to have a rethink. But again, that's disruptive economics, and that's coming to people are beginning to see that you cannot have growth on a finite planet. We have hit the limits.
Yep, absolutely.
And if we keep pushing those limits, then we're into collapse.
Yep.
And that's the point. Everybody understands that with a balloon. I can't understand why they can't see it with the planet.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask what you're working on now, because you're working on a lot of different stuff, and I wanted to ask what projects you're working on now, and I wanted to ask, what advice would you give young people who want to get into environmental activism or climate activism in general?
So when I left politics, I did so because I couldn't see there would be any real progress on the climate in the next few years, because I couldn't see that you'd have anything other than Liberal Party governments. And so I was 62, pretty exhausted, and also had a grandchild on the way, and I wanted to make sure that I had time to be a grandmother. And so since then, I've got 2 fabulous little grandchildren who I enjoy very much. But I work pro bono with 10 different organisations, all climate and biodiversity related, and do everything I can to promote them, and they're all complementary. So I work with, I'm on the board of the climate mobilisation in the US. They were the ones who pioneered the climate emergency idea, on the back of work that people like David Spratt and others had done in Australia. I work with the Climate Accountability Institute out of California, and that's terrific because that is actually quantifying the responsibility for how much of global warming of specific companies. So they've done all the work looking at how much you can quantify for ExxonMobil, for example, in order to take into those court cases that the kids are doing. I'm working with the solar heads of state to try and roll out solar projects around the world. And I'm on the advisory board of the Borneo project, trying to stop the logging in Sarawak, the conversion to palm oil, and of course protecting the cultural cultural areas and the habitat of so many threatened species in Sarawak. I'm on the board of the Colong Foundation, which of course is active on forests and wilderness protection in New South Wales. I'm on the board of the Bob Brown Foundation, working on forests and of course the anti-mining and trying to protect the tarkine here. I'm an ambassador for the Global Greens, so promoting green politics around the world. I'm an ambassador for the Invasive Species Council.
Wow. You must be very busy.
Just released a report on the impacts of feral deer in Tasmania, trying to get a change, because here we not only have fabulous heritage buildings, but we have a minister with a mentality that thinks that heritage ideas like stuffed deer's heads over the mantelpiece are a good idea, and when they're destroying so many wild areas of Tasmania. I'm also, as I mentioned, supporting the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. I'm sure there are others. I'm also a patron of the justice investment process, if you like. Jailing is failing, so working with JRI. So any number of things, I'm working on it.
And what would you say to young people who want to get into the movement, or want to, because I'm sure there's a lot of people, young people out there, and older people as well, who are worried about climate and ecological collapse, but they don't know how to get into the movement. What would you recommend for them?
Start today.
So
the first thing is, yes, it all looks pretty hopeless, and I agree with that, and I think we are beyond the tipping points, and I think we are going to have really unforeseen consequences, and I'm quite terrified about that. But you can either give in to that and you can despair, or you can say, you know what, I'm going to make it less worse than it otherwise would have been, and I'm going to give it my everything. And I'm also going to work on the assumption that something will fall out of the sky. On the assumption that the massive period of disruption, which we are currently experiencing in every which way, no matter what you're talking about. So what I'd also say is, expect in this age of disruption that something's going to fall out of the sky. You don't know when it's going to happen. You keep banging your head against the damn wall, and then one day it'll break, and that's exactly what I'm doing with Lake Pedder. One day we are going to restore Lake Pedder, and that damn wall is going to break. So the guts of it really is never ever give up, because you just don't know the point at which everything will flip.
Yeah.
But we do know that if not enough people are engaged, then that is going to take longer.
Yeah.
So, the other thing, of course, when I say start today, no matter what you're doing, you can actually take some action, either personally or in your work, but certainly regardless of what you're doing, you can pick up the phone to a radio station, talk back. You can write a letter today to an MP. You can join a protest. You can go online and support people who are out there protesting. You know, I can't say enough how much when you're in the midst of a protest and everybody's getting stuck in, how great it is to have people sending you a message saying, I can't be there, but you speak for me.
Yeah.
That it really matters, and that's something that older people can do, and I say that to grandparents, especially older people. Okay, you mightn't want to be out on the forest floor and campaigning and stuff, but you can help your grandkids because they can't risk their future careers in many cases by being arrested, because it might mean that they can't get a visa for some countries or whatever. But you can. You've had your life. You can be incredibly radical and incredibly powerful. And if you look at the media, when you see grandmothers and grandfathers standing up on the front line, they frequently get interviewed because people are intrigued that older people have actually gone out.
Do you know Audrey from Melbourne?
I don't know Audrey, but I know of Audrey.
Yeah, so Audrey's a friend of mine. We met through Extinction Rebellion. She's in her 70s and she's been arrested 4 times, and she's locked on with a bike lock onto a coal plant up in Mackay in central Queensland, and she calls herself the badass grandma. Yes. And she is absolute powerhouse. And she just inspires like so many people. And you know, she's pretty small, but she's very tough, and she stands up to power. And watching her do these things gives other people around her so much power as well. Exactly.
And so that's really my advice. Find a way.
Yeah.
There is no excuse. Everybody can be involved in some capacity or other, and you'll be amazed, because not only is it a great thing to do for the environment, for the earth, it's actually a great thing to do for yourself personally, because it gives you that purpose in life. You feel enlivened, you feel like you're actually doing something, because taking control of the situation and doing something is just so much more energizing and healthy than sitting home feeling like you're a victim and you've got no power to actually do anything.
Yeah, I felt the same when I started, and because as I said, I was quite frustrated and depressed watching the news, you know, watching the government do nothing year after year. But then when I got into activism and started meeting people in the climate movement and started doing things, I did, as you say, I felt a lot of purpose. And there's that saying that action is the best antidote to despair.
It's true.
And it's so true. Yeah.
It's true. There is nothing more disempowering than just sitting feeling sorry for yourself, feeling a victim, feeling like there's nothing that you can do and it's all going to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can actually think, you know what, I can do something, and I will.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's just a P button on the end. And now, Christine Milne, thank you so much for a fantastic conversation today. Really enjoyed it. And thank you for driving this electric vehicle today.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. It's great.
Awesome.
Really enjoyed driving a Tesla. I've been in them before, as I mentioned, but I've never driven one. So it's been a lovely opportunity. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much.